Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Landhuis, and I'm the Director of SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, and we're an initiative of Equitas, the Prosecutor's Resource on Violence Against Women. And I just want to thank everyone for spending their afternoon with us. We're going to be going over Know It, Name It, part of our Stalking Awareness Month webinar series, both this week and next week at the same time. And we just want to thank you all for your participation, and also want to thank OVW, part of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. Allison Randall is with us this afternoon, is going to say a few words about OVW as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join today. The Office on Violence Against Women is really prioritizing addressing stalking issues. You see that as an office-wide priority. So we want to encourage you to address stalking in all the work you do and to really highlight stalking awareness during the month of January. You know, we are open, so please contact us if you have any questions. We're really excited to be able to support you, and we're really proud to support Equitas in this project.
Thank you so much, Allison. We really appreciate your support. So for those of you that are not familiar with SPARC and the services and resources that we offer, on the screen you'll see a list of the things that we can provide to those of you who are OVW recipients, as well as those of you that are hoping to be OVW recipients. We provide in-person training, so we can come out and do training for law enforcement or victim advocates, multidisciplinary trainings, as well as webinars such as this. And just so all of you know, we do record the webinar today, and it'll be available on our website within a couple of days. And you can download the materials to the right-hand side of your screen where it says materials, and there's a download file. You can get a copy of the PowerPoint there. We also provide several online resources as well as individual and organizational assistance. So if you're working on a specific stalking case, or your organization is looking at improving your policies and protocols on stalking, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to assist you in those situations, as well as promoting all the things that we do during National Stalking Awareness Month. So as many of you know, January is Stalking Awareness Month. This happens to be the 15th anniversary of Stalking Awareness Month. And as such, we're providing these webinars in addition to a wealth of other resources on our website. So if you go to our website, which is stalkingawareness.org, you'll not only find information that you can use throughout January, and we've tried to make that as easy for you as possible, giving you sample social media sites and posts, as well as newsletter highlights. And we also have on our website, when you go there, please check out some of the other resources. We have victim resources for individuals who are experiencing stalking. While SPARC does not provide direct services to victims of stalking, our charge is to help all of you who are doing direct services improve your response to victims of stalking, as well as hold offenders accountable. So please check out our website. You can also follow us on all the social media that you see listed up there. We would love to interact with you and find out more about what you're doing for January, as well as throughout the year, to promote awareness and response on stalking. So today we have a couple of objectives. This is just our fair use claim to let you know that some of the material that you might see today, you might see in other people's PowerPoints. But our objectives today are really to try to identify the dynamics of stalking, recognize and discuss the intersection of stalking with both domestic and sexual violence, as well as identify some of the common technologies used in stalking incidents. So one of the things I'd like to know from all of you, our friends at SCJ are going to bring up a poll for us, is what discipline are you representing today? So you have a couple of choices here, and just click the button that most identifies who you identify with as a professional. So we have advocacy, law enforcement, prosecutions, corrections, mental health providers, and then the infamous other category. And if you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat, if you clicked other, what discipline you represent, that would be super helpful to me as I facilitate today. It looks like a majority, not surprisingly, of us on the phone are in an advocacy or sometimes some type of prevention education. Great. Lots of you that are saying that you clicked other identify as being prevention educators. So hopefully you'll find today super helpful as well, because not only do we look at the response to stalking victims, but we also look at the education and prevention issues that we're working on around the country. So thank you all for participating in that. And then the second question I have for all of you is, how much training have you received on stalking before? A is, this is my first training. B, I've had a little bit. C, I've quite a bit. And D, I am an expert. And some of you might have to click again. Awesome, those answers are populating. It looks like we kind of have a split between those that are saying, I've had a little bit, and others that are saying, I've received actually quite a bit. No one's saying that they're an expert. I think you're all afraid I'm going to say then you can join us in facilitating the webinar. And a few of you that are saying this is your first training. That's not unusual. One of the things that we've noticed across the country in terms of the response to stalking is it kind of reminds me, since I've been in the gender violence field for a long time, of our response to domestic violence about 25 years ago and our response to sexual assault about 15 years ago, and that we really are at the point where a lot of our efforts are focused on awareness building and getting people to recognize that stalking is a crime and a crime in and of itself, as well as also trying to figure out how do we promote awareness within the sexual and domestic violence field, but outside of that as well. So what do our services look like for individuals who might not be a victim of intimate partner stalking? So thank you all for participating in the poll. I appreciate it. So one of the things that we're going to start off with today is defining stalking. And we use both a behavioral definition as well as statutory. And because we're being joined by all of you from across the country, you can rest assured we're not going to go through all 50 state statutes this afternoon. But instead we're going to focus on the behavioral definition, which we define as a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And there's a couple of things that we want to point out within this definition. The first is the pattern of behavior. And so for many state statutes, as well as our behavioral understanding, we define a pattern of behavior as 2 or more incidents. Now, some state statutes might actually say it needs to be certain behaviors or a certain number of behaviors, but it's important to keep in mind that a pattern usually requires 2 or more. And then when we say directed at a specific person, one of the things that we know about stalking is that oftentimes it spills over into other people. So we have a primary victim, and then when the stalker isn't getting the reaction that they want from the primary victim, or they're increasing their stalking activities, they often spills over into other individuals. So other family members or friends or people that are close to the victim's child. But we know that usually there's one particular person that the offender is targeting, and that the behavior often spills over into others. And then we say it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And people often wonder, why did you put that in the definition? Do we not think victims are reasonable people? But one of the things that we know about stalking is it's highly contextual, that oftentimes something that means something to the victim might not mean something to other people. And that fear is really hard to articulate. So I want to show you a really quick video that takes a good look at fear here. And Alicia, or Anna and Patricia are going to bring that up for us. You can go ahead and stop it, Anna. Thank you. One of the things that we know with this particular video is that we have some people that would react typically very similar to the way the female reacted in this particular video. They'd be over the top scared, very frightened, and others of us would be very typically reacting similar to the male identified person in this video, who would be like, I don't get what the big deal is. Like, that wasn't scary at all. One of the things that we know is when it comes to fear, every person's reaction is different. And some people might say, well, perhaps the female in this particular video overreacted. Well, what if I changed this scenario and told you that this particular individual had been bitten by a black widow spider and had an allergic reaction before and had spent several days in the hospital as a result of being bitten by that spider? Your interpretation of her reaction might change, because now I've given you context behind why she reacted the way that she did. And that's one of the things that we know in stalking cases, is that oftentimes we fail to get the context, or we fail to really understand the context behind stalking situations, and instead only see the situation and what the victim articulates to us at the surface level. So it's really important when we talk about stalking to, number one, think about the context, that something might be frightening to the victim, but not to those of us that are the responder, and that oftentimes particular behaviors have a meaning that's only understood between the offender and the victim. So something might seem really innocuous to the rest of us, like it's not that big of a deal, but means something very specific to the victim. And unless we can get the victim to articulate why that means something, it can be really difficult when we go forward and look at reporting to, say, law enforcement. The other thing that makes stalking difficult, and when we refer to context, is that stalking criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. It's not criminal to send somebody a text message. It's not criminal to drive down a public street or show up at somebody's place of employment unless we're looking at that in the larger context. So it may be that we're looking in that within the violation of a civil protection order, or we're looking at that as part of the behavior, the pattern of behavior that's happening in a stalking case. And so it can be really difficult when we have those of us, including all of you who identified as victim advocates, but for law enforcement as well. Many times in our criminal justice field, we are what we call incident-based, meaning that we're looking at a particular incident that has happened and only that particular incident. So for instance, if law enforcement is called out because a victim's tires have been slashed, they're oftentimes focused on just that property crime that occurred, and they might not be looking at that within the larger context of what happens in a stalking situation. And even those of us that are advocates, I think it's fair to say that we're incident-based oftentimes as well, and that victims are often reaching out to us after a particular incident has happened. And so what can make stalking cases difficult is unless we kind of expand beyond that individual snapshot of what has just happened and really look at the entire picture, we sometimes miss some of the stalking behavior that's happened, and we sometimes miss our opportunity to move forward with a criminal case. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of statutes when it comes to stalking. Unfortunately, all state statutes are different. None of them are the same. But all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, do have statutes regarding stalking. There's also a federal statute regarding stalking, which if you cross the state lines to commit the offense, it rises to the federal level, as well as many tribal codes that address stalking, as well as the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which also has a pretty robust addressing of stalking within their context of what's expected from their military members. One of the things that we want to talk about today is the prevalence of stalking. And one of the things that can be really difficult is as we look at the prevalence of stalking, there's been lots of information out there about the, it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 and lots of different statistics that occur out there. What we will tell you is that the best data will tell us that within a 1-year period, about 5 million women and about 2 million men experience stalking. And that information comes from the NISPIS study. And the most recent report out, that was an analysis of the 2015 data that reports it's about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men that will experience stalking. One of the things that we'd like to point out is that we really don't have great data for the LGBT community. And so as we look at some of this information, these are folks that self-identify as female or self-identify as male within this study. The other thing that I would like to point out to you is the CDC recently changed their definition. So in the NISPIS study, they used to ask victims of stalking and identify individuals as victims of stalking if they were, quote, very afraid of their offender, which was problematic for us at SPARC because when we look at and interact with victims, as so many of you on this call know, many victims of stalking will not articulate that what they feel is fear. They'll say they're really frustrated, they're really upset, they might be scared, but they many times won't identify that they're very afraid. And so when that question was being asked, we actually saw that it was underestimating the prevalence of stalking. And so from some really robust discussions with the CDC and others, that definition was changed within the last couple of years, but the new data is not out yet for us to analyze. But I do know that in conversations with the CDC, they've been in contact with us to say the rates now are looking at more like 1 in 4 because they've removed the very fearful piece and just saying that a reasonable person would feel fear. So it's one of the things that we need to keep an eye on and continue to look at as we move forward because I think we'll actually see that some of the prevalence rates are going to be more reflective of people's true experiences and will actually be closer to like a 1 in 4 ratio for women. What we also know is some of the dynamics of stalking is that 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rates of stalking. And if this was an in-person training, I would ask all of you why you think that is, and you're more than welcome to chat it in the chat box. But as many of you guessed, it happens for a couple of reasons. Number one, 18 to 24-year-olds don't have fully developed brains and are often in the position where they're learning about romance and romantic relationships and how do you pursue those relationships. And we also know that lots of 18 to 24-year-olds reside on college campuses. And so if you're being stalked on a college campus, you can imagine how it might be difficult to be able to get away from your offender if you live on the same college campus, if you happen to reside in the same dorm, if you eat in the same dining hall, et cetera. We also know that women are more likely to experience stalking than men, but that regardless of the gender of the victim, most offenders are male. And that's surprising to a lot of people. So what happens is when we look at the breakdown, if we have male victims, and half the time they're stalked by a female offender, and in half the time they're stalked by a male offender. And that often is confusing to folks. And one of the reasons why that is oftentimes we have a male offender who has been stalking a female victim as the primary victim, so an ex-girlfriend, an ex-wife, someone that they're targeting, and then that female gets in a new relationship. So they get a new boyfriend, they get a new husband, and then the stalking offender starts stalking that person. So it has spilled over from the primary victim. It's what we call target dispersion in these cases. And as well as many of you will also guess that when we look at stalking cases, a majority of victims know the offender. In fact, the breakdown is about 60% of female victims and about 40% of male victims are in a current or former intimate partner relationship with the offender. But I would like to point out that one of the things that can make stalking difficult is that means that 40% and 60% of stalking victims are not in intimate partner relationships. And so that causes us a little bit of a pause as we look at our response efforts in that many programs and policies, et cetera, around stalking are housed within or fall under a intimate partner violence umbrella. And while we absolutely don't want to underestimate those services, and absolutely they're needed, one of the things we need to think about is where do victims of stalking who are not being stalked by a current or former intimate partner, where do they go for services? What does the response look like for them? How would they know where to reach out to for help? So I can give you an example. Sometimes we've had stalking victims reach out for assistance because they've called a local shelter and they can't get into the shelter because they're not being harmed by a current or former intimate partner. It's a domestic violence shelter and they don't meet the qualifications. Or perhaps they can't qualify for civil order of protection because they don't meet the statutory definition that they're related to that person by blood or marriage. So keeping in mind that one of the things that we want to think about when we look at our response to stalking is not only what does that look like within the context of the domestic and sexual violence work that we're doing, but what does it look like for all the other victims who are stalked by an acquaintance or a stranger or a family member? How do they know where to reach out for help if, for instance, the local program is called a Family Crisis Center and I'm not being victimized by somebody who's a member of my family? So just something to think about as we move forward in some of the gaps that we see for individuals who are experiencing stalking. So let's talk a little bit about stalking behavior. And when we really try to look at the big picture, we're not only looking at the course of conduct that's been happening in a case, but we already talked a little bit about context as well as impact on the victim. So what has been the impact on the victim in these particular cases? And one of the things that people really struggle to figure out is identifying the course of conduct that happens in stalking cases. And in most instances when we say, let's name some of the stalking behaviors, people are really great about saying things like following someone around or looking at someone's social media or sending constant phone calls and messages. But sometimes we forget to look at some of those other behaviors that fall within that course of conduct. And some of the best research out there that really takes a multidimensional look at all the stalking behaviors was put out by Dr. T.K. Logan and Robert Walker, and really uses some great intuitive things to help understand that particular behavior. And they classify those behaviors in 4 different categories. So they talk about surveillance behaviors, life invasion behaviors, intimidation, and interference. And so at SPARC, we often use the acronym SLY to remember these particular behaviors. And so when we look at those behaviors, those can break down into things like for surveillance, it could be following somebody or watching somebody. Sometimes some of the behaviors that people often miss are how does the offender obtain information about the victim? Is that old school talking to other people who are close to the victim? Is that looking at the victim's social media? Is it looking up information about the victim's employer and coming to the place of employment of the victim? And you'll also see listed on there proxy stalking. Proxy stalking happens when we have a third party who's stalking on behalf of the offender. So it could be that the offender has been arrested and is in jail and is supposed to not be making contact with the victim. And instead, the offender has their best friend or their brother or someone else who's keeping tabs on the victim instead. So that's what we call proxy stalking, when they engage a third party to stalk a victim. The other piece, so surveillance is a pretty easy to understand piece of the stalking behavior. Life invasion is a little bit more difficult, and it's often these behaviors that get overlooked when we're talking about the course of conduct that happen in stalking cases. So it's things like unwanted contact at home, the phone calls. It could be property invasion, so coming on the property of where the victim works, where the victim's children go to school. Things like public humiliation. If you've been doing this work for a really long time, public humiliation would be putting like flyers up on trees or buildings, and now it's simply posting on social media. Or things like harassing friends and family. And that life invasion piece of things is really difficult for lots of victims to be able to articulate and document when they're looking at a criminal case, and it's often some of the things that get overlooked when we look at our advocacy efforts, because victims are so used to it happening in their situation that they oftentimes fail to articulate it to those of us that are first responders. The other thing that we see happen is intimidation. So obviously threats, property damage, forced confrontations is one we see very frequently in stalking cases. So the offender will show up someplace that they know the victim is likely to frequent, and combining that with the life invasion, try to embarrass the victim. So they might show up at the victim's place of work, or the coffee shop that the victim frequents, or the gym that the victim goes to a lot, and force the victim to talk with them, or force a confrontation that ends up embarrassing the victim. Lots of offenders also threaten to harm themselves in order to try to get the victim to feel sympathetic for them, or they threaten to hurt the victim or themselves in other ways as well. We also see interference happen frequently, where we have financial and work sabotage. So we have lots of stalking offenders who end up doing things like opening up accounts in the name of the victim, or turning on and off their utilities, or getting a hold of their social media accounts and posting things that could interfere with their work. It's one of the things that we see happen quite frequently, and one of the things that we'll talk about when we talk a little bit about the technologies that are used. We also, of course, see physical attacks, road rage, custody interference happen. But one of the reasons that we spent a little bit of time going over these particular slides is when we look at that course of conduct that happens in stalking cases, oftentimes victims will focus on the behaviors that have had the most emotional impact on them, and safety plan, and come up with safety issues, et cetera, around those particular instances. And sometimes we fail to think about what else might be occurring in those situations, or help prepare the victim for what else might happen. So talking about, like, what kind of passwords do you have on your social media account? Are you worried that the offender might show up at the kids' school? Are you worried about the offender gaining access to your bank account? Those types of things, all which can be really helpful when we look at documenting the behaviors that have been happening, as well as helping safety plan as we move forward with victims. So if you want a copy of that particular study, you're more than welcome to reach out to us at SPARC. I'm happy to send it to you. If there's any research nerds on the phone like myself who would like to actually delve into that study, I'm happy to send some of that to you. But we also know is, as we look at stalking cases, what can also make them really difficult is they change over time. And so oftentimes when we have offenders who end up not having access to a victim. So say, for instance, you've worked with a victim, and you decide as you're working with a victim, and the victim decides that one of the things that they want to do is change their phone number. And it used to be a pretty common thing that most people would recommend to victims of stalking. If the offender was calling over and over and over again, then the responding law enforcement or responding advocates might just say, just change your phone number. But let's play that out. Do we really think that the stalking offender who, after the victim changes the phone number, will call the victim and get that, I'm sorry, this number has been disconnected, and suddenly the offender's like, oh, I guess I'll stop stalking the victim? We know that doesn't happen. Instead, the offender simply shows up where the victim's at, or shows up at the victim's place of employment, or maintains a different way of making contact. And so one of the things that can make stalking so difficult is that when we look at these particular situations, we're often safety planning or looking at our case around a particular incident that has been happening or particular behavior, but we know that stalking is dynamic. And so offenders don't just give up when they get the, I'm sorry, this number has been disconnected on the phone. They just stalk in a different way. So it's one of the things that we need to think about, that when we talk about stalking cases, the duration is different for lots of different victims. The intensity varies and the frequency varies. And that can be one of the things that makes it so terrifying for lots of victims, is they never know when the offender is going to show up. They never know what's going to happen next. If there's a sudden stop in the behavior, they don't necessarily breathe easy. They just wonder what's going to happen next. And so when we talk about responding to victims, one of the things that's really important is that to understand the level of fear that a victim is experiencing, we also have to have a good understanding of that context. And that context also needs to center around what has been the course of conduct in those particular situations. And keeping in mind that oftentimes when we're interacting with victims, as all of us know, that fear can be masked by other emotions. It might be things like frustration or anger or hopelessness. So keeping in mind that it's cumulative over time. And so the longer the victim has been experiencing this behavior from the offender, the more invasive and the more distress and fear that the victim will feel in these particular situations. One of the questions that we often get when we look at stalking situations is, well, why do stalkers stalk? And I wish I had more than a tongue-in-cheek answer where I would say, if we knew the answer to that, we would market it nationwide and we wouldn't have a problem with stalkers. Because unfortunately we don't have really great solutions or a really strong understanding of why it is that stalkers stalk. We do know that some of the motivations include things like seeking affection. So they might be trying to pursue a romantic relationship, power and control, which all of you will see as reminiscent of the domestic violence situations, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. For some offenders, it's because they've been rejected by the victim or they become obsessed with the victim. In some situations, it's because the offender's planning to commit a crime, and that crime is sexual assault, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And some simply because they continue to get away with it because there's never any repercussion for what has been happening in these particular situations. So let's take a little bit closer look at the power and control piece of things. So when we talk about stalking and domestic violence, obviously this wheel is familiar to all of you on the webinar today. It's adapted from the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project Power and Control Wheel. But one of the things that was a really big aha moment to me early on in my advocacy career is when stalking happened within the context of domestic violence, I often chalked it up to just part of the power and control. So I can give you an example. For instance, if I was working with a victim and the offender was texting her all the time or was showing up at her work or was not allowing her to use a vehicle, etc., we would say things like the offender's just really jealous or really controlling or they're really possessive. And we would chalk it up to part of the behaviors that happen within the context of the domestic violence. And while that's true, we never actually named those behaviors as stalking behaviors. We didn't say, oh, when he's tracking her all the time or when he's showing up at her work all the time, he's actually stalking her. And some of you might be thinking, well, what's the point? Like, why should we call it stalking behaviors? I don't see the point in that. Part of that is because we know that intimate partner stalkers are our most dangerous stalkers. They're much more likely to physically approach the victim because they feel a sense of ownership to the victim. They're more insulting and threatening because they know all the information about the victim. And they're more likely to use weapons. And their behavior escalates really quickly. These are offenders who, because they feel a sense of entitlement to the victim, end up reoffending over and over and over again. They're usually not held, when they are held accountable, that accountability usually doesn't change their behavior. And what we also know is when we look at domestic violence cases and where stalking has been happening, that the lethality risks for stalking happening within the context of domestic violence are exponentially high. We know that 76% of femicides, so 76% of female homicides were committed by an intimate partner, and had at least one episode of stalking within the year prior to the murder. So stalking happening within the context of domestic violence is one of our huge red flags that these are some of our most dangerous cases and are cases that are most likely to end up with a female being harmed or killed by the offender. We also know that 85% of attempted femicides had an episode of stalking within the year prior to the murder. So if you're looking at stalking within the context of domestic violence, one of the reasons that we say it's really important to name the stalking is to help us understand that increases the likelihood of lethality happening in the case. And we know that oftentimes victims sometimes need those words when they go forward to be able to say to the offender or to responding law enforcement, the offender is stalking me. And what we know oftentimes is that when stalking is happening within the context of domestic violence, if it's reported to law enforcement, they simply consider it part of the domestic violence, and there isn't a separate stalking charge, even when the report might have everything that an officer might need to actually make the stalking report. So the other thing that we want to look at when we talk about lethality, some of you might be thinking, okay, so now that we're looking at stalking within the context of domestic violence, how do we pull out those particular cases that might be at an increased risk of danger for victims of domestic violence? And one of the things that we know is across the country, there's lots of threat assessment that exists around domestic violence issues. So some of you might be familiar with things like the lethality assessment plan or the danger assessment, the Mosaic method, the Idaho risk assessment of dangerousness. Many of these threat assessments are out there and are particular to domestic violence cases. So they're specific to domestic violence incidents. So what happens if we have a stalking victim come in who isn't being stalked by a current or former intimate partner? Then can we use a lethality assessment plan? Could we use a danger assessment plan? The answer is no, because those risk assessments only apply to domestic situations. And so for a long time, we were really trying to look at what kind of assessment can we use in stalking situations. And so we are lucky enough that one of the assessments that exists out there has been modified and used particularly to identify stalking situations. And so if you're not familiar with this assessment, this is called the SHARP assessment. It's called the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. It's put out by Dr. T.K. Logan in the study that I just mentioned, and actually contains a free assessment that you can do about that helps you identify the risk for stalking victims. And the reason that we like it, you may have seen briefly on your screen the lethality assessment plan, which is really popular around the country for identifying information regarding domestic violence lethality. However, what we know is A, that only applies to domestic violence situations, and B, even in domestic violence situations, it doesn't necessarily identify the stalking behaviors in a way that we would like it to. Obviously, there's some questions about is the offender jealous or do they spy or leave messages, but if you don't understand the context of stalking, you might miss these as part of the lethality assessment plan. Please don't take that comment as meaning that we don't like the lethality assessment program. It's an amazing program and it's an amazing tool. It just has its limitations when we talk about stalking specific behavior. So the other thing, when we talk about the coercive control, folks are always like, well, can we use this assessment in our work with individuals across the country? Absolutely. So if you just go to coercivecontrol.org, and my colleague Dana is putting the link up on the site for you, you can go to the right where the red arrow says enter a stalking, harassment, assessment, and risk profile. I'm hoping all of you are on the phone thinking, hey, I would love to actually use this assessment, but I want to look at it before I use it with a victim, which I would encourage you to do so. As you get on there, this particular assessment is gathering data for us to be able to use to hopefully get this assessment to the point where we can use it in court. And so having it evaluated, supported by data, et cetera. So one of the questions that you'll be asked when you get on the assessment is, are you just getting on here to kind of test this particular assessment out? And you can say yes. And you can go through there and enter some questions, et cetera. What's really nice about this assessment is you can use it as a third party. You don't have to have the victim there with you to answer the questions. The thing that can be difficult with this assessment is it's not something that, say, a responding law enforcement officer could use. It would probably best be utilized by somebody who has much more time and space to be able to spend with a victim and using the assessment because it is longer and will take probably about 45 minutes for you to do. But the really great thing about SHARP, and one of the reasons that we really like it, is it not only spits out a narrative report, so it'll give you kind of a synopsis of everything that's been happening in this stalking situation, but it will also give you some safety suggestions. So for instance, if within filling out the assessment, you identify that the victim, gets off of work at 2 a.m. and works at a hospital and has to walk out to the parking lot alone, one of the safety management things might be, let's see if we can get security to walk the victim out to their car. It certainly wouldn't take the place of all the great safety planning that all of you do with victims, but it is a really great tool to kind of trigger ideas about safety and some of the things that you can safety plan with victims around. And I know if any of you on the phone are like me, we oftentimes work with victims and then victims leave our office and we're like, oh shoot, we should have talked about X, Y, or Z. So this is a great way to kind of put everything in a concise story and tailor the safety suggestions around that. And again, it's free to use. There's no cost to the assessment. So you can go on there and use the assessment. You can play around with it to see like what kind of questions it asks. When it gives you the summary, it will give you a PDF link that will only last for a couple of days and then it disappears. That's kind of a safety guard. So if, for instance, the offender will get on a victim's computer afterwards, they wouldn't be able to access the safety plan or the assessment. So just know that if you do it, you would want to print it off if you're using it in a particular case that you're working with a victim or to provide to the victim. It won't be available for very long after you do the assessment. And so just as a little bit recap, obviously when we talk about threat assessment, we always want to look at the safety planning that goes along with the assessment as well. What does that look like? How do we provide that? And what is safety plan, and how does safety plan look different for victims of stalking as it would for victims of domestic violence? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I see on the chat many of you asking for this study regarding, and I'm not sure if Dana can pull that. Dana works with me at SPARC. I'm not sure if Dana can pull the study up quickly enough. If she can't, please just email me. My email is going to be at the end of this presentation. I'm happy to send you a copy of that particular study because I can see lots of you asking for it. It's nice to know there's other data nerds on the phone with us. So, and I say that affectionately, not as a criticism. So let's also look at the intersection of stalking and sexual assault. And this is where sometimes, as a field, I think we've really fallen short. Most of us have made a pretty good connection between stalking that happens within the context of domestic violence. It's just a little bit more difficult when we look at the intersection of stalking and sexual assault. And so when we look at that intersection, what we see happen is oftentimes the stalker either threatens to sexually assault the victim themselves, or they try to get somebody else to sexually assault the victim, or they actually sexually assault the victim. And so let me give you a couple of examples. So this is an example of an offender who was trying to get other people to sexually assault the victim. So he and his girlfriend had broken up. She had broken up with him because he was exhibiting behaviors that she didn't appreciate and thought of as violent. And so when she breaks up with him, his revenge to her is to post an ad in a Craigslist ad saying that she wants to have casual encounters and wants to have sex with men across the country and to please contact her. And so she actually ended up being contacted by numerous individuals who were attempting to sexually assault her. And he did this as his form of revenge. And some people might look at this and say, well, that's not a stalking case. But he had gathered all this information. He engaged in a course of conduct through gathering all that information and posting it online where he was creating a fearful situation for the victim. And so this offender was not charged with stalking as part of the course of conduct, but instead was charged just with a sexual assault offense. And when we look at these particular situations, we often see it as a missed opportunity for us as responders and as a criminal justice system to really look at the behaviors that have been happening in cases like this, and also consider the fact that this is also a stalking case. And so keeping that in mind as we move forward to other instances where we see stalking happen as part of sexual assault in what we would call repeat sexual assault perpetrators. So those offenders, and if those of you on the phone are familiar with David Lezak's study, looking at sexual assault offenders who have committed more than one sexual assault. And what we oftentimes find is those particular offenders will choose their targets intentionally. They identify folks who are vulnerable, young women, somebody who might lack credibility, and they contact that individual multiple times. So they might invite them to a party, they might message them through social media, and oftentimes when they commit this sexual assault, they're applied with drugs or alcohol, and they're isolated. So they might set up a room to sexually assault victims, and then they contact the victim afterwards, saying, thanks for a great time, you want to go to the party again. And when we look at this contact that has been happening in those particular situations, it's a course of conduct that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And what we see in jurisdictions across the country is that when we have individuals who are investigating these situations, they may not be able to charge a sexual assault. They might decide that they have, when it comes to the court system, they don't have a case that will hold up past the defense that the offender will say, you know, the victim wanted it, all those terrible things that we hear as part of sexual assault. But what they do have is an offender who might be able to say, you know what, I did call her, I did go to the party with her, we did, and in an effort to get themselves off of the sexual assault charge, they end up admitting to a lot of the behaviors that constitute a stalking case. And so we have several really great detectives across the country who are looking at these cases with a new lens saying, you know what, I might not be able to prove the sexual assault crime, but I can prove the stalking crime, which is also in many cases a felony as well. And so they identify another way to be able to bring a stalking charge forward in sexual assault crimes that perhaps they haven't considered before. And so one of the things we need to be thinking about for those of us on the phone who are part of an advocacy effort is to also look at, when we're working with sexual assault victims, are they experiencing stalking from the offender? Is that offender likely to continue to make contact with them? And many offenders are. They're making contact through social media, et cetera, not necessarily to threaten the victim, but more like a, why are you reporting this to everybody? Like, why are you going out of proportion? You were all over me at that party. But that continued contact, if it's unwanted, might constitute a stalking case. So keeping in mind as we're looking at these cases that we often see an intersection that gets overlooked, especially when we talk about stalking and sexual assault. All right, Dana just uploaded the study. So for all of you that commented that you want the study, it's on your materials form there for you. So I think that will be, thank you, Dana, a little bit easier than all of you getting emails from me. So thanks for doing that, Dana. So let's talk a little bit about all the forms of technology. And I wish we had longer time to spend together today. This is not an in-depth technology training. This is merely an overview of some of the technologies that you might see. We are happy to provide some in-depth technology training to you, so reach out to us if that's something you would like to have in your jurisdiction. But some of the things that we see as far as technologies that are used in stalking cases are things like, obviously, social networking sites, texting and messaging apps, so going beyond just sending text messages, but using apps like WhatsApp or Snapchat, spyware or keylogging, cameras, GPS devices, and then a new emergence of technologies that we call smart devices, so things like Alexa or Google, et cetera. So thinking about those technologies, one of the things that I always like to do whenever we talk about technology is focus a little bit of time on the good technologies. One of the things that we want to point out is technology doesn't cause the stalking. Stalking happened way early in my career when stalkers actually had to get up off a couch and go stalk somebody, and they don't have to do that anymore because there's an app for that. But knowing that the stalking happened way back before the technology happens, it certainly facilitates it. Yeah, and Judy was also saying for smart devices, you see sometimes the term Internet of Things. So one of the things that we want to focus on in this particular segment is to also give you some of the good technologies out there. So this is one of the wins for those of us that do the good work. This is called trap call, and trap call can be effective if you have a victim who's receiving numerous calls from the offender, and the offender is simply dialing *67 before they call the victim. So as many of you know, because you're advocates, you often dial *67 to block your number from showing up on somebody else's caller ID, and we see offenders do this all the time as well. Well, the victim can actually put an app on their phone that will unblock the block that's put on by *67. So if the offender is dialing *67 and calling the victim and hanging up or just calling constantly, 375 times a day, the victim can put this on their phone for as little as $4.95, and it will unblock the block. So it will show up as the offender's phone when the victim denies the call. So this is a resource that I highly recommend to anybody who's doing victim advocacy work. The offender will not know that the victim has this on their phone unless the victim tells them, but it will unblock the block, and it's a way for her to capture or him to capture information about how often the offender is calling. So this is one of those wins for us good guys. So I highly recommend that you look at trap call as an option for some of the victims that you're working with. What we also see happen in lots of these cases is what we call spoofing. And Patricia and Ann are going to bring up a video for us on that.
Can you remain anonymous when you call someone? The best way is using spoof card. With spoof card, you can change your caller ID to anything you want so that the person you call will never see your real phone number. How? Simple, go to spoofcard.com, buy as many minutes as you want, and get your access phone number and unique PIN number. To disguise your phone number, follow these 4 simple steps. 1. Call the access number. 2. Enter your PIN number. 3. Enter the number you want to call. And 4. Enter the number that you want to appear as the caller ID, then place your call and spoof away. But there's more. You can even change your voice to sound like a man or a woman, so not even your mom will recognize who's calling. So much fun! Plus, you have an awesome feature that allows you to record your conversations for future reference. Also, you can use your PIN with any of our iPhone, Android, or BlackBerry apps for even easier spoofing. Start spoofing today at spoofcard.com. Disguise your phone number.
So one of the things that we see emerging as an issue across the country is offenders who will spoof their phone number. So what we typically see happen is a victim has been working with a law enforcement officer, an advocate who has said, don't answer the phone when the offender calls, and maybe the offender will leave a voicemail message or it will at least show up on caller ID, and then we can gain some of the evidence that we need in these particular cases. Well, the offender has figured out a workaround and instead will actually try to spoof the call to look like their mother or the daycare person or the kids at school, so that when the victim sees, for instance, daycare showing up on her caller ID, she picks up the phone and it's not daycare, it's actually the offender on the other end of the phone who's then talking with her. So it's a workaround for them to be able to get a hold of the victim. We also see offenders who will use it and then leave messages for victims like, oh, your appointment at court got rescheduled. You actually don't have court tomorrow. You have court on Thursday. Or you don't have your child custody hearing today, or you don't have your supervised visitation appointment. It's been rescheduled till Thursday. And then the victim shows up for the supervised visitation visit, and supervised visitation folks are frustrated with her because she missed her appointment and didn't call. And she says, no, actually, you guys called me, and pull up caller ID, and it has the number of the supervised visitation center, but the offender has spoofed the call or spoofed the message. So one of the things that we encourage you to think about as you're working with victims is to set up perhaps a password or a safe word that if, for instance, you're going to leave messages about court or something like that, you let the victim know that it's actually you. Can be a little bit of a workaround. We also know that texts can be spoofed as well, so victims can get text messages that are spoofed in addition to phone calls, which can be really frustrating for victims because they may actually try to report something like this and they contact law enforcement. Law enforcement comes out and the victim says, you know, my stalker has been calling me. They pull up their caller ID and all it shows is 25 calls from their mom, not 25 calls from the stalker because the calls have been spoofed. And if you have a responding law enforcement officer or someone else who's involved in the system who isn't familiar with how spoofing works, they think the victim's making things up or perhaps not being clear with them, et cetera. And so it can be one of those things can be really nerve-wracking for victims as well and fear-inducing. You can imagine if the offender's on the other end of the phone, but it shows up as her mom's phone number, she might think the offender's actually at her mom's. Is the offender harming her mom? So one of the things that we would encourage you to think about when we talk about call spoofing is bringing this particular issue up with victims, asking them if they're concerned about it, letting them know that it exists. And it can be pretty hard for law enforcement to try to trace some of this information. And we're not going to get into that today, but know that when it comes to spoofing, it can be pretty difficult if the offender is using one of the apps like you see on this particular slide for us to try to gain evidence information off of the offender's phone, et cetera. That can be really difficult. We also see offenders using what we call cell phone spyware, and you're going to see a video that exists and was out there about a program called StealthGenie. That was a program that was, surprise, invented by a stalker. So StealthGenie no longer exists as being available to buy, but there are numerous technologies that are very similar to that. So Anna and Patricia are going to show you that video about the spyware as well.
So, you want to keep an eye on your loved one or your employee because you suspect they're hiding something and it might get too late? How do you know where they are or what they're doing right now? Maybe they're not really telling you the truth about their activities or whereabouts. You are worried, so you wonder if the only way to find out is to know what they do on their cell phones right away. You know that's the only way to give you all the answers. What you need right now is a solution that lets you uncover the truth by secretly monitoring all the activities of your loved one or employee and lets you know their location at all times. Don't worry, there's a powerful solution and it's called StealthGenie, the most powerful cell phone spy software available on any iPhone, Android, and BlackBerry phone, especially designed for you, but also used by over 100,000 satisfied customers. So how does StealthGenie mobile spy software work? Well, it's simple. You install StealthGenie spy software on the phone you want to monitor once, and you will not need to access the phone again. As soon as you install StealthGenie, it will instantly start to upload all the information from the phone you're monitoring. You can view all this information straight away by logging into your online StealthGenie member panel. You will remotely control the phone. You'll be able to record and listen to their calls, view their call history, SMS log, emails, contact book, appointments, internet browsing history, photos, videos, and instant messenger chats. Read iMessage conversations. Read WhatsApp conversations. Instantly find out where they are by tracking their GPS location. Even better, you'll receive alerts when they leave a certain area or enter a prohibited location. Receive instant alerts when a suspicious caller is calling or texting the phone. StealthGenie is so powerful that you can even listen to the phone's surroundings from your member panel. And that's not all. There's many, many more features that StealthGenie includes. The best part is they'll never know that StealthGenie is running on their phone because it's totally invisible. It's like having your own personal genie living in the phone. Now you're wondering, all these features, gosh, how easy would it be to install? It's simple. You buy online, simply install the application on their phone by following the easy instructions sent to you by email, log into your online StealthGenie member area, and start monitoring remotely straight away. Installation is so easy that even your granddad will be able to spy on any phone instantly. This is why we've been featured by several popular media outlets. Be one of the over 100,000 existing customers using StealthGenie all over the world right now. We're so confident that you will love StealthGenie that we're offering 100% satisfaction guaranteed. Otherwise, we will give double your money back. StealthGenie, the most powerful cell phone spy software, letting you monitor any phone remotely, silently, and easily.
So understandably, some of you are typing in the chat, how can this be legal? So SpyGenie was one of the softwares that was actually taken down as a result of a lawsuit. And several companies, understandably, have gotten lots of bad publicity after marketing it in this way. And so rather than just stop making the software, they instead change who they market it to. And so now what you'll see are apps or software called similar to something called Spyzie. It's S-P-Y-Z-I-E. And Spyzie has gotten around to this issue by marketing it towards parents who want to monitor their children's cell phones. So if you get on or Google any of the cell phone monitoring spyware, many of the things that you will see are not actually targeting these particular situations, but are instead targeting, hey, let's keep your child safe, so why don't you put it on your child's phone? But some of them are pretty blatant and will actually say, hey, if you think somebody's cheating on you or you want to catch your cheating lover, go ahead and put this on your phone. Many of you will want to know, is it possible to put it on the phone remotely? Absolutely. So if you have access to somebody's iCloud account, et cetera, you could put on it that way. So that's one of the things that can be super concerning for victims is if there's spyware on their phone, the offender has access to everything. They can see emails, text messages, et cetera, everything that's been done on the phone. And one of the questions we always get is, well, wouldn't a victim be able to actually see things on their cell phone? Like, wouldn't they actually see the app? Many of us have phones that look like this, and there's so many apps on their phone that a victim might not be able to see it, or they might just have the app looking like something else. So some of the apps actually will look like a calculator or something else, so that if the offender puts it on the victim's phone, the victim might not have any idea that it's on their phone. What we can tell you is if a victim suspects that it's on their phone, the one way that we have found to be the most helpful is we'll have victims who report that suddenly their data usage spikes up really high. So one of the things that we'll see is that, you know, they normally use like 1 gig of data. Now suddenly they're using 5 gigs of data because the offender is accessing their phone over and over and over again. But other than that, or knowing that the offender's had access, or they might hear clicks, et cetera, on the phone call, other than that, there's not a great way of knowing if there's spyware on the phone. One of the ways that we usually determine that is we'll in our discussions with victims, figuring out, like, how does the offender have information? What kind of information do they have? If they have knowledge that you're going to go to your mom's house tomorrow, who did you tell that to? Did you send a text message to somebody? Did you send an email to somebody? Trying to determine how the offender might be gaining some access to that information. One of the things that you can try is to do a factory reset on the phone if the victim thinks that there's spyware on their phone. But the problem is, if you do a factory reset, you have to reinstall everything back onto your phone, and you may inadvertently reinstall the spyware back onto your phone. Or if you get a whole new iTunes account or whatever, Google Play account, et cetera, then the victim ends up paying for apps that they already owned. So it's one of those things that when we say do a factory reset on the phone is one that we would say recommend that cautiously, and knowing that what some of the repercussions are for that, and that if they don't change their iTunes or their Google Play accounts, they may just inadvertently re-put the spyware back on the phone. So unfortunately, Yvette said, is there a way to find out? Not for sure, no. You can, if you're involved in criminal investigations, sometimes law enforcement is able to do what we call a cell phone forensic exam, and they're able to analyze the phone, but that involves the victim giving their phone up for that analysis to occur, and they may be given it up for several weeks or several months. So just know that that can be an issue as well. You guys had some great questions on those. The other thing we see, obviously, and some of you mentioned it, are GPS systems. And oftentimes we all default to thinking about the GPS systems on our cell phones or on our computers, but we also see GPS devices showing up in different ways, including all the things that you see listed on the slide in front of you. One of the more popular things that we see keep popping up in stalking situations are child trackers. So they are devices that are marketed, again, to keep your children safe, and offenders are using these devices and putting them, say, for instance, on a victim's car or in a victim's purse or someplace where the victim goes, and then monitoring the victim through that particular tracker. We also see these given to children of victims as a gift. So it might be a tracker that's in a backpack or in a pair of shoes or in a new watch or something like that, so that if the offender is watching the child, they're also watching where the victim goes as well. So keep in mind that those GPS devices are going beyond just the cell phones and the computers to be really small devices like you see on your screen that have that ability to monitor somebody in real time. From GPS, we also see an event called GeoTagging. So one of the things that can happen is, with all of us taking all of our photos on cell phones now instead of on cameras, that most of us are taking photos and actually geotagging them. And geotagging just happens when you are putting the location, including the latitude and longitude coordinates of a photo, on a photo without really knowing it. So let me give you an example. So this is a picture of one of our trainers and I. So this is Detective Kurkowski from St. Louis and myself at a training. You would have no idea where we took this picture because it looks like every other training room with its bland beige walls until you were able to, let's see if it's going to show up, use what we call an EXIF viewer. And an EXIF viewer actually will help you identify information that is on a picture. And EXIF viewers are free to use on the web. So this is just a web viewer that I used. I just typed in EXIF viewer, and it brought up Jeffrey's EXIF viewer. And so then I took that viewer and clicked on a picture that I had on my computer, this particular picture, and it gave me all the information about this particular picture. So you can see that it was taken on March 2nd of 2016. It gives you the longitude and latitude coordinates of where the picture was taken. And then it says, based on that, we guess that you were at 2200 Interstate Drive in Columbia, Missouri, which is indeed where this particular picture was taken at. So sometimes what happens is we have victims who are posting pictures and all this information is on the picture and they don't even know it. And if the offender simply uses an EXIF viewer or an EXIF viewer app, they're able to gain that information. So the way to get around that, I'll show you in just a minute, but what we also see happen is when victims are posting this on social media sites, some social media sites will actually remove the information from the picture. Others won't do that. So after some negative publicity, some of the big sites like Facebook and Twitter and eBay Instagram, unless you're adding it to your photo map, will actually strip the EXIF data off a picture. So if you regularly post pictures to Facebook, you don't have anything to worry about. They're taking the EXIF data off of it. But some of the other sites like Google or Google+, Tumblr, which is really popular with teenagers, Dropbox, email, none of those sites actually take the data off the picture. So if a victim posts a picture, an offender might actually be able to get the location of the victim or the victim's house or where the victim's at off of that particular picture. So one of the things to consider for victims is to either, as we're looking at cell phones in general, think about, we talked about wiping the phone, et cetera. For the EXIF data, you can simply turn off the location on your camera. So if you just Google, how do I turn off location on an iPhone 8 Plus, it will show you how to turn off the location on your camera. Or victims could actually use one of those sites like Jeffrey's EXIF Viewer or others and remove the EXIF data from the picture. But the easiest way is to just turn it off on the phone so that when the victim's taking pictures on a cell phone, that information isn't showing up on the picture when it's being posted. The other things that we would mention as far as cell phones in general is thinking about when we work with victims. Sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to suggest things like, hey, stop, change your phone number, hey, get a different phone, because oftentimes this victim will continue to receive phone calls or text messages or emails from the offender, and that allows us to gain additional evidence. But one of the things we might want to actually consider is, instead of saying to a victim, hey, change your phone number, get a new phone, keeping the old phone and letting the offender continue to call, continue to send text messages, continue to send emails, but the victim doesn't have to have access to that phone. They can put it in a drawer, and they only look at the phone when they come to meet with their advocate or when they go to make a report to law enforcement. And instead they get a newer, cheaper phone that they give a safer phone that they have access to with her friends and family, and they keep the old phone in hopes that the offender is going to continue to leave messages and evidence on the old phone. So again, like I said, the victim doesn't have to look at the phone or access that phone. I'm not suggesting that we emotionally traumatize victims. I'm saying that when they do, they might want to do so in the accompaniment of their advocate or someone else. So hopefully that makes sense to all of you on the phone. And then let's look really quickly at smart devices. Someone mentioned this is sometimes referred to as the Internet of Things. I think that's kind of confusing to folks. Smart devices is usually what people will understand a little bit more easily, but if any device has access to the internet. So our houses are getting smarter and smarter as we as a society get smarter and smarter, or maybe not. So there are things like refrigerators or Alexas, et cetera, that can be controlled remotely. And so what we sometimes see happen is we have victims who have everything hooked up to some of these devices, and then the offender is able to gain access to the device through their router or another system, and they have access to the password because many of us use the same password over and over and over again, or they simply reset the password. Many of us know that when we look at our financial accounts or other things that we do, we have a tendency to use the same password over and over again, or we have our security questions set to something that the offender knows the answers to. So for instance, if you've ever locked yourself out of your bank account, you have to oftentimes access your security questions, and it'll say things like, what's your mother's maiden name? Or what's your first pet's name? Many times the stalker knows the answers to those questions. So they'll simply hit the reset the password button. They'll go in and reset the password and gain access to the victim's account simply because they guessed the answers to the security questions. So one of the things you need to be thinking about when you're working with victims is, how do they answer the security questions on their devices or on their online accounts? Do they answer those truthfully, and would the offender know the answers to those and be able to reset the password? So the way that we've seen smart devices used in stalking cases can be things like suddenly turning on the air conditioning in the middle of winter because they have access to the thermostat, opening the garage door, making purchases on an online account like an Amazon account, et cetera, and spending all the victim's money. So keeping in mind that when we talk about smart devices, many times they're connected through a home Wi-Fi or home router that the offender can have access to. And so thinking with victims, what might they have in their home that's a smart device that could be accessed by the offender, and how do we make that device safer, or how do we consider whether the device is still in the home, et cetera. So And then let's talk briefly about social media. I wish we could spend this whole training on all the forms of technology because that's usually what gets interaction from all of you and all the questions. But consider this a little bit of a teaser, and we're happy to do additional trainings with all of you. But obviously, many of you know that the way that we're seeing social media used in these particular cases is we're either having offenders gather information about the victim off of social media, or they're posted on the victim's page, or posting about the victim on their own page. But we also have seen a huge increase in offenders making up fake sites. So they will make a fake Instagram or a fake Facebook account for the victim and then make contact with other people. So for instance, I had a victim that I was working with whose law enforcement officer ended up contacting us and saying, somebody's created a fake Instagram account for the victim. Well, the victim's Instagram account was simply their name, and the offender had provided additional, just put a new Instagram account up and added an S at the end of the victim's name. The offender had a picture of her because they were former boyfriend and girlfriend, and so when you looked at Instagram, you thought this was the victim's account. So people would start following the victim's account, and then the offender would start direct messaging that person nude photographs of the victim in an attempt to humiliate her. And she had no idea that an Instagram account was created until her brother actually contacted her and said, why are you sending me naked photos of yourself by Instagram? And she's like, what are you talking about? And then they got on Instagram and found this particular site and account information that he had created for her. And to her embarrassment and astonishment, it had lots of followers that she knew. So she was completely blown away that he would go to this particular length to try to humiliate her. And she was embarrassed to try to bring it forward. She was worried when she contacted law enforcement, what is this going to entail? Are they going to ask me questions about where the pictures came from, et cetera? And as many of you know, we see many instances where offenders are trying to get back at or take revenge on victims by posting those intimate images and distributing those intimate images across the internet. And so it's something to keep thinking about as we look at social media, et cetera, on how do we help victims in those particular situations. And we're happy to give you some of the resources that exist out there that can help victims who've been victims of this particular online aggression, and can perhaps get some of those pictures taken down. We've actually seen a better response come from threatening websites with copyright violations rather than saying this is a fake account, but this person posted a picture that they don't have copyrights to. And many times some of the sites are more receptive to taking down pictures because of a copyright issue than they are because it's a privacy issue, which is unfortunate. So let's talk a little bit about safety planning and advocacy. So we've talked about some of the ways that stalking happens within the context of domestic violence. We've talked about some of the ways that happens within the context of sexual violence, as well as some of the technologies that are used. So what does it look like then when we're safety planning with victims? And this is a brief overview. We would highly encourage you to go to our website, and under victim resources and under victim service provider resources, we have safety planning documents on there about how do you safety plan with victims. Because what we're really looking at when we're looking at what victims are afraid of is many victims feel like they're losing their mind because they don't know what's going to happen next. And so they could benefit from safety planning that talks a little bit about what to do, what happens next, as well as safety planning that focuses on the emotional trauma that has been happening in those particular situations, benefiting from going to support group or maintaining contact with a mental health professional, somebody that can help them through all the trauma that they're experiencing as a result of the stalking. We also want to focus on not only the safety pieces, but advocacy and documentation and support as well. And so in understanding when we look at safety, is there a threat of imminent harm for the victim or for other people? And what can be really difficult in stalking situations is oftentimes what's recommended to stalking victims is to no longer make contact with a stalker. Don't contact the stalker, don't text the stalker back, don't call the stalker back. And while that's easy to recommend from an outside perspective, it's a very much harder thing to actually do as a victim of stalking, because we know that oftentimes victims of stalking will make contact with their stalker, number one, if they have children in common because they're court-ordered, etc. But sometimes they do it as part of their safety planning. Sometimes victims of stalking are reaching out to their stalker to see what kind of mood he's in, to figure out, has he been drinking tonight? Where might he show up? What might be happening right now? They might be trying to negotiate for their safety. And so what can be really hard is although we know that not engaging is the best situation, we know that realistically that's not always possible for lots of victims. And so being able to have that real conversation with victims in saying things like, we know that even if you answer on the 75th time they call and you say, leave me alone, I don't want to have any contact with you, and you hang up, the stalker next time is going to call 76 times because they know on the 75th time last time you answered. So knowing that even that intermittent reinforcement can urge the stalker on, but that for so many victims, it's impossible for them to not have any contact with the offender. And sometimes they're doing it for their own safety. So just being able to have that discussion with victims, some civil protection orders, some state statutes don't want victims to be able to contact their offender, and it makes it really difficult to move forward with charges if they do. But I think it's really important that we have this very real conversation with victims about what that engagement looks like, and helping them understand that we understand why they may continue to engage the offender, but also being aware of the problematic pieces of doing that and that it might actually reinforce the offender's behavior. For some victims, it can be helpful for them to have a picture or flyer or show people that they work with pictures of the offender. What we oftentimes see is if the offender is a current or former intimate partner and they've moved out of the apartment building, et cetera, that other people don't know that he's not supposed to be there anymore. So having that conversation with victims, but also trying to balance, do they want to tell other people? Are they embarrassed? Do they not want to tell other people? And then thinking about what some of those safety accommodations might look like. Do they need to tell their employer? What about school or a college situation or their housing situation? Who can they enlist that can help keep them safer? And what does that look like as far as the repercussions for victims who might be worried about other people finding out or embarrassed or perhaps worried that they might lose their job, et cetera, as a result of the stalking? The other thing that we want to look at are civil orders of protection, because we often get questions from folks saying, how good are civil protection orders in stalking cases? Unfortunately, we know that 81% of male victims had a violation and 69% of female victims had a violation of their civil protection order when it was in place. Like anything when we talk about domestic violence, these orders can be only as good as the enforcement. Are victims willing to call law enforcement, and what happens if law enforcement comes out? What are they likely to be able to do? What does that look like for violations? Is somebody arrested? Are they just cited, et cetera? And then oftentimes when we look at civil orders of protection, we sometimes have jurisdictions that victims of stalking who aren't intimate partners don't qualify for a stalking civil order of protection because they don't meet the current or former intimate partner protections. So keeping that in mind as well. And then when we go on to look at some of our other considerations, some of the things that we would like you to think about are defining your roles with victims. Are you an advocate that works within a prosecutor's office or a law enforcement office, and what's your confidentiality look like versus a nonprofit organization advocate's confidentiality? What are some of the policies and procedures you have in place? What we often see across the country is that law enforcement offices or others oftentimes have policies and protocols for how to respond to domestic violence situations or how to respond to sexual assault situations, but they don't have policies about stalking. They don't have a coordinated response about stalking. They don't have a packet of information that they give out to every stalking victim they work with like they do for every domestic violence victim or every sexual assault victim. So really trying to look at what kind of organizational things do we have in place as far as policies and procedures, and what does our community coordinated response look like in issues of stalking? Around the country, I hear of lots of CCRs that are addressing domestic and sexual violence, but very few that are addressing stalking, especially outside the context of domestic violence. And then keeping in mind when we're talking about safety planning, remembering that as we put victims in contact with other people, we're not obviously guaranteeing safety, but we're thinking about those individual strategies that might help increase a victim's safety. And we've got some great resources on our website that kind of outline things that you might want to consider, like a victim's life situation. What are some of the risks that are perpetrated by this particular stalker? So for instance, you might have a stalker who is in the IT industry or a stalker who works for the phone company. Does that change our looking at safety planning? Absolutely. We might have systemic barriers that accessing the criminal justice system isn't considered the safe option for many victims. And so what does that response look like? As well as some of the things that we talked about with some of the issues of technology. And thinking about as we listen to victims and ask questions, what are some of the specific risks that are happening in these particular situations? What are some of the resources that we can provide, and how do we provide education about things like disengaging from the stalker in a way that is done so without judgment for victims of stalking, as well as identify some of those resources. When we work with individual organizations about improving their response to stalking, oftentimes we'll see that they have lots of information, lots of brochures, lots of information on their website about how to safety plan if you're a victim of domestic violence or a victim of sexual assault, and very little about stalking. So thinking about what kind of message is your organization sending, whether you work for an advocacy organization or in another role, how do people know what kind of services you provide for victims of stalking, and what does that look like? As well as being able to talk with victims about what are their next steps if something happens. How do we reassess the safety plan if things are changing, as they often do? As well as understanding how do we hook victims up with advocacy support? What does that look like? Who advocates for victims of stalking in our jurisdiction? Sometimes I've had law enforcement say, well, I didn't know our domestic violence and sexual assault agency would work with victims of stalking because they've never talked about it. And helping victims understand, for many victims, information is golden. Understanding what the reporting process looks like, or the criminal justice system. Do they have an option for a civil protection order? All that access to information can help them gain a sense of control within their life. And it can also help them understand, what kind of documentation might I need in these particular situations? What we see happen all the time in stalking situations is everyone tells victims, keep a journal, or keep it, document what has been happening, but we don't tell victims what to document. We just say keep a journal. And then they keep like a 500-page journal that they bring into law enforcement and say, here's all the documentation of everything that's been happening. And the law enforcement officer is like, great, I don't have time to read a 500-page journal. Or the information that they kept isn't helpful. So rather than keeping a journal, we would say keep a documentation log. And you can find this on our website. So this documentation log is just a sample of something that we would suggest victims keep. When you find it on our website and download it, it also has an additional page of information that instructs victims on how to keep the log. But it includes the date and time and the description of the incident, the location of the incident, which we found to be really important because stalking oftentimes occurs in so many jurisdictions. So we might have a victim who lives in the city and works in the county, and her mom lives in a different city, and perhaps she's reported certain incidents to law enforcement, and she gets frustrated because the city officer doesn't seem to know what the county officer does, and the county officer doesn't seem to know what the city officer had for information, because victims don't understand that jurisdiction means that, the city officer isn't the same as the county officer, and they don't share this, magical computer system where they know about everything. So we also include victims to include lists of witnesses' names. And oftentimes I've found that you have to coach victims a little bit on this one in helping them understand that witnesses can also be people they were talking to on the phone, or somebody that was in their house when the offender, instant messaged her, et cetera. And including if the police were called, what was the report number and the officer name and badge number, which can be super helpful if we, as we build this, continue to be able to build our response and help victims understand and organize the information that has been happening in these particular cases. So the documentation log is super helpful. Please print it out, use it, rebrand it to have your information on it for whatever you need to use it for. The only thing that we would caution you is please don't edit the log to include how the particular behavior made the victim feel, because if we put on here, the offender showed up at the kids' school and that really frightens the victim, it doesn't bother the victim when he shows up at her workplace. If the victim turns this over to law enforcement, and law enforcement then in turn has to give it to the prosecution in this particular case, the prosecution then has to give it to the defense, who gives it to the offender, and so we just ended up inadvertently educating the offender that the thing that causes lots of harm to the victim is showing up at the kids' school. So the first thing the offender will do when they get out of jail is show up at the kids' school. So you'll note that we in particular do not put on there how it makes the victim feel for a very particular reason, because we don't want to educate the offenders in those particular cases. And it's never been my experience that victims forget how the behavior made them feel. They might not remember if it happened on a Wednesday or a Thursday or what they were wearing or where they were at when it happened, but they very much remember how it made them feel. The other resources that we would call out attention to as we wind up our time today is As was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, SPARC is a project of Equitas, which is the prosecutor's resource on all violence against women issues. So we highly encourage you to check out their website as well, and you can gain access to our website from there, or you could just go to our website. The other thing that we would mention is our partnership with the great folks at the National Network and Domestic Violence Tech Safety team. They have an amazing app out there that talks about all things tech safety. So if your head was spinning a little bit during the tech portion of this webinar, please go to their website. And you can actually go to the app and use the app online, or you can download it for free in any type of Play Store. And it's extremely helpful to use with victims. So you can see on there it says things like harassment or impersonation. So if you have a victim who's worried about cell phone safety, they could go to this app and look at all the different options for cell phone safety. Now, obviously, if we're worried that the victim might have spyware on their phone, it wouldn't necessarily be the best thing for them to put the actual app on their phone. But all of you who are advocates or working with victims in any way, shape, or form, please put it on your phone and when you're working with victims. This is our SPARC website, again, just to give you a little bit of glimpse on what we have available there. All the information for January Stalking Awareness Month is under the Stalking Awareness section. The resources that we talked about today as far as materials and safety planning, et cetera, are all listed under the resources button. And if you want additional training, you can contact us under the training information. So we're happy to do that. The materials for this webinar today are, again, under this little box where you're chatting, where it says materials, know it, name it, stop it, the webinar. So the PowerPoint slides are actually there. And the thing that we would call out to you is we always want to leave you with a what's next. And so what we would like you to consider is, if you're an advocacy agency, or even if you're not an advocacy agency, one of the things that we would encourage you to think about is, what kind of messages are you sending to stalking victims? What does it look like? How are you addressing stalking within your organization? And so we've actually made a checklist for you. So if you go to our website and look under the resources for victim services providers, there's a checklist for domestic violence and sexual assault organizations, getting you to think about what's available out there. What kind of information do you send to victims? What kind of resources do you have? What's on your website, et cetera? So we encourage all of you who are on the webinar today to take that as your next step, to be thinking about what can we do next within our organization. And I see several of you asking, is there going to be a recording of this webinar? There is. It takes us a couple of days to get it, but it will be posted on our website. So if you go to, again, to our website, and I'll bring up the picture again for you, under the training, we have in the drop-down menu, we have archived trainings there, so we'll put the webinar on there. And then just a reminder that next week, we're doing part 2 of this webinar. Today was Know It, Name It, in understanding stalking. Hopefully, several of you are saying you found today helpful, which is great. Next week's going to be Stop It. How do we put some of these things that we've learned today into effect for our organization and really build our coordinated community response around the issue of stalking? So we ended a couple of minutes early today, and I'm happy to answer some questions via the chat, and Dana's doing an excellent job. It'll take probably 2 or 3 days for the webinar to post on our website, Stephanie, so look for it then, and we're happy to put it on there. And anything that SPARC can do to help you. If you go to our website and the About SPARC, you'll see all of our contact information. We're happy to speak with you via phone or via email, because we believe that we can absolutely not end stalking without all of you. We're so thankful for the work that all of you do every single day. We know that all of you do the hard stuff, and that many of you are working day in and day out to increase the safety of victims, and we're so grateful for the work that you do. And we appreciate the fact that you spent 90 minutes with us today, and hopefully found today informative and helpful in your work, and we're happy to help you make the next step. So if you want to register for part 2 and you haven't been able to, if you go under training, it's under our upcoming event. So you can register for part 2 next week, and Dana just put the link up there for you as well. So please reach out to us if there's anything we can do. Follow us on all of the social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter as well. And once again, thank you for everything that you're doing on behalf of stalking victims, and we'll hopefully see all of you next week.